The Arizona Badlands have always harbored secrets, some buried in shallow graves, others carried in the hearts of those who've lost everything. When a gang of notorious horse thieves decide to target the wrong widow's ranch, they'll soon discover that some women aren't just survivors. They're hunters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dawn broke reluctantly over the superstition. Mountains, casting long purple shadows across Rebecca Harlan's ranch. The day promised to be another scorcher, the kind that made the air shimmer and dance above the parched earth. At 53, Rebecca had weathered enough Arizona summers to know that work started early or didn't get done at all. She moved with practiced efficiency through the modest kitchen of her ranch house, the coffee pot already bubbling on the ancient stove. Through the window, she could see the stable and corral where her 5 horses grazed in the morning light. Those horses were more than livestock. They were her livelihood, her companions, and her last connection to Thomas. Rebecca poured her coffee black, strong enough to stand a spoon in, just the way Thomas had taught her during their 30 years. Together, she took a sip and winced at the heat, but didn't put the cup down. Small discomforts were part of ranch life, and Rebecca Harlan had never been one to shy away from discomfort. The sound came suddenly, faint at first, then growing in intensity. Hoofbeats, multiple sets, approaching fast from the eastern property, line where the land dipped toward Rattlesnake Gulch. Rebecca stiffened, setting her coffee down with deliberate care. No one rode that fast on unfamiliar terrain unless they were running from something or toward something. Her hand moved instinctively to the lever-action Winchester that hung on the wall beside the back door. Thomas had insisted she learn to shoot it the day after they were married. "The desert doesn't forgive mistakes," he'd told her, "and neither do the men who prey on those who make them." Rebecca lifted the rifle down, checking the loading gate with a practiced motion. Fully loaded. She always kept it that way. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, and now she could hear men's voices, laughing, calling to each other. Not the voices of neighbors in trouble. These were confident, brash, unconcerned with being heard. She moved to the front window, staying to one side of the frame. 3 riders had already reached her corral. 2 were opening the gate, while a third kept watch, a rifle balanced casually across his saddle. They weren't bothering with stealth, operating in broad daylight, as if they had every right to be there. Rebecca's jaw tightened. The abandoned mining towns of the superstitions had been drawing a rougher element lately. Drifters, bandits, men who'd found the law too close for comfort elsewhere. Thomas had warned her of them before the cancer took him. She'd expected them to come eventually, but not like this, not so bold. She watched as they began herding her horses, whistling and calling as they circled the confused animals. One of her horses, Domino, the stubborn paint stallion, reared and neighed in protest. The nearest rider cursed and swung a rope, barely missing the horse's neck. "Easy money, boys," called the tallest of the 3, a raw-boned man with a hat pulled low over his face. "We'll be drinking in Diablo Crossing by sundown." Rebecca had seen enough. She moved to the door, rifle in hand, and stepped onto the porch. The morning sun hit her square in the face, momentarily blinding her. She squinted against the glare, raising one hand to shield her eyes. The men froze at the sight of her, a lean, hard-faced woman with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, standing as straight as an arrow. Despite her years, a Winchester held with casual competence in her weathered hands. "Those horses aren't yours to take," she called, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. She kept the rifle pointed at the ground, but her finger rested near the trigger. The tall man turned his horse slowly to face her. Now she could see him clearly, mid-30s, with a pockmarked face and cold eyes that sized her up with predatory calculation. He wore a duster despite the heat, and the bulge beneath it suggested he wasn't relying solely on the revolver holstered at his hip. "Well now," he drawled, "what do we have here? A little old lady playing rancher." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Ma'am, these fine animals are being requisitioned by the Dixon brothers. Perhaps you've heard of us?" Rebecca hadn't, but the name meant nothing. "Men like these went through identities like snakes shed skin. I don't care if you're the governor's sons," she replied evenly. "This is Harlan land. Those are Harlan horses, and you're trespassing." The shortest of the three men, barely more than a boy, with a patchy attempt at a beard, snickered. "Harlan, that'd be Thomas Harlan's spread, wouldn't it?" He looked around theatrically. "Don't see old Thomas anywhere. He's been feeding the worms for months now." Something cold settled in Rebecca's stomach. They knew Thomas was dead. They'd chosen this ranch deliberately. The leader, Dixon, if that was really his name, smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "You see, Mrs. Harlan, that's the trouble with widows trying to run ranches. No one to watch your back." He nudged his horse a few steps closer. "Now, we'll be taking these horses. You go back inside, brew another pot of coffee, and forget you saw us. That way nobody gets hurt." Rebecca didn't move, didn't blink. "Last warning, let my horses go and ride out." Dixon's smile faded. "Lady, you're either very brave or very stupid. There's 3 of us, all armed. What exactly do you think is going to happen here?" Rebecca raised the Winchester in one smooth motion, sighting down the barrel. "I think you're about to find out why Thomas married me in the first place." The third man, who had been silent until now, suddenly drew his pistol. Rebecca didn't hesitate. The Winchester cracked, the report echoing off the mountains. The man screamed, his pistol flying from his hand, blood streaming from his shattered fingers. "Jesus Christ!" the young one yelped, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. Dixon's face had transformed, all pretense of amusement gone. "You've made a serious mistake, woman," he growled, his hand hovering near his own weapon. "Your friend's bleeding pretty bad," Rebecca observed calmly, already working the lever to chamber another round. "Might want to get him looked at before he passes out. Nearest doctor's in Copper Springs, about 4 hours' ride." She aimed again, this time at Dixon's chest. "Or you can try your luck right now. Your choice." For a long moment no one moved. Dixon's eyes bored into hers, searching for weakness, for fear. Rebecca stared back, unflinching. Finally, Dixon spat on the ground. "Mason, tie up that hand before you bleed all over my horse," he ordered the wounded man, who was swaying in his saddle, face pale. To Rebecca he said, "This isn't over, Mrs. Harlan, not by a long shot." "It is for today," she answered. Dixon jerked his head at the younger man. "Come on, Ryan, we're leaving." Then to Rebecca, "You remember my face, woman. You'll be seeing it again." "I'll remember," she promised. "So will the sheriff." Dixon laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Sheriff Parker? You go right ahead and tell him. Man's got a fondness for looking the other way when properly compensated." He ruined his horse around. "Enjoy your horses while you can." The 3 men rode off, the wounded one, Mason, moaning as his horse jostled his injured hand. Rebecca kept the rifle trained on them until they disappeared into the shimmering heat haze. Only then did she lower the weapon, her hands suddenly trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She crossed the yard to the corral, where her horses were still agitated, moving in tight circles. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice helping to calm them. She checked the gate, securing it properly, then ran her hand along Domino's muscular neck. "They won't take you," she promised. "Not while I'm breathing." Back inside, Rebecca placed the Winchester on the table instead of returning it to the wall. She had preparations to make. The Dixon gang, if that's who they really were, wouldn't wait long before trying again, and next time they'd come prepared for resistance. They'd likely return at night, perhaps with more men. She moved with renewed purpose, pulling supplies from cabinets, checking ammunition stores, mentally cataloguing what she would need. Thomas had taught her to be prepared, and in their 30 years together, she'd learned every hard lesson the desert had to offer. The coffee sat forgotten on the counter, growing cold. Rebecca had more pressing concerns now than her morning routine. She needed to defend what was hers, and she needed information. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. Just past 7. If she rode hard, she could make it to Copper Springs by noon. Sheriff Parker might be in Dixon's pocket, but there were others in town who might talk. Bartenders, shopkeepers, old-timers who kept their ears open and their mouths shut until asked the right questions by the right people. Rebecca had grown up in these mountains. She knew their secrets, their hidden trails, the places where a person could disappear or watch unseen. If Dixon thought she was just a helpless widow, easy pickings now that Thomas was gone, he'd made a fatal miscalculation. She changed quickly into riding clothes, strapping on her husband's old gun belt. The Colt revolver was heavier than the Winchester, but sometimes a sidearm was more practical. Finally, she pulled a leather-bound journal from the bedside drawer, Thomas's detailed maps of the territory, including places most folks didn't know existed. 15 minutes later, she was saddling Mercury, her fastest horse. As she tightened the cinch, she heard Domino nickering from the corral, watching her with intelligent eyes. "Don't worry," she told the paint stallion. "I'm coming back, and I'm bringing help." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She swung into the saddle, adjusting her hat against the now blazing sun. The Dixon gang had picked the wrong widow to rob. They thought they were the predators, but they'd soon learn they were the prey. Rebecca Harlan knew how to hunt, and she knew these mountains better than anyone alive. She just needed to know who she was really. Hunting. The ride to Copper Springs took every bit of 3 hours, even pushing Mercury harder than she liked. The little mining town hadn't changed much since Rebecca had last visited, 6 months ago, when she'd come to settle Thomas's affairs. The same false-fronted buildings lined the dusty main street, the same saloons still advertised clean rooms and cold beer on a faded sign, and the same air of slow decline hung over everything. Rebecca tied Mercury outside Granger's general store, giving the tired horse an affectionate pat before heading inside. The bell above the door jangled as she entered, and old Walter Granger looked up from his ledger, recognition dawning on his lined face. "Rebecca Harlan," he exclaimed, setting down his pencil. "Twice in 1 year. To what do we owe the pleasure?" Rebecca had known Walter since childhood. He'd been ancient even then, or so it had seemed to her young eyes. Now his wispy white hair and gnarled hands spoke of a man who'd seen the century turn and hadn't been impressed by the new one. "Information, Walter," she said, removing her riding gloves. "What do you know about the Dixon brothers?" Walter's bushy eyebrows rose. "Dixon? You mean Craig Dixon and his crew?" He glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "What's your business with them? They paid me a visit this morning, tried to take my horses." Walter's face darkened. "Lord have mercy, you weren't hurt?" "One of them was," Rebecca replied. "I sent them packing, but they'll be back." Walter shook his head slowly. "Rebecca, if Dixon set his sights on your place, you'd be wise to sell up and move on. That man is poisonous, him and his brother both." "Brother?" Rebecca leaned forward. "There was only one Dixon, far as I could tell. Tall, pockmarked face. Had 2 others with him, a young one named Ryan and another called Mason." "That'd be Craig," Walter confirmed. "Older brothers Jackson Dixon. Even meaner, if you can believe it. They run everything from here to the territorial line. Protection. Rackets, horse thieving, worse things when the mood takes them." He sighed. "Sheriff won't touch 'em, not after what happened to the last lawman who tried." Rebecca absorbed this. "Where do they operate from?" Walter hesitated. "Rebecca, don't go getting ideas. These aren't ordinary rustlers. They've got it. Least a dozen men riding with them, maybe more. They've killed people, women too. Where, Walter? Rebecca pressed. The old storekeeper sighed. They've got a camp up in Apache Basin. Old mining claim that played out years ago. They use the tunnels for storage, stolen goods, contraband, you name it. He studied her face. But you can't go up there, Rebecca. It's suicide. Rebecca didn't confirm or deny her intentions. Instead, she asked, Thomas's old friend Henry Blackwood is still around. Walter nodded slowly. Run the livery now. Still the best tracker in 3 territories, despite that wooden leg of his. Good. Rebecca straightened. I need supplies, Walter. Ammunition, coffee, jerky, medical supplies. Can you put that together while I talk to Henry? Walter looked like he wanted to argue further, but recognized the set of her jaw. It was the same expression Thomas had worn whenever his mind was made up. I'll have it ready in 20 minutes, he conceded. Rebecca thanked him and headed back into the harsh sunlight. The livery was at the far end of town, a sprawling wooden structure that smelled of hay and horseflesh. Inside, the air was cooler, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the dimness. Who's there? Called a gruff voice from the shadows. An old friend in need of advice, Rebecca answered. A figure emerged from between the stalls, a bear of a man with a silver-shot beard and shoulders broad as an oak door. He walked with a distinctive gait, his left leg moving stiffly, the thud of wood on dirt marking every other step. Henry Blackwood had lost that leg during the Apache Wars, or so the story went. Thomas had pulled him to safety under heavy fire, and the two had been inseparable friends ever since, until Thomas's cancer had separated them permanently. Henry squinted, then broke into a wide grin. Rebecca Harlan, as I live and breathe. He crossed to her in 3 quick strides, enveloping her in a hug that nearly crushed the air from her lungs. Why didn't you send word you were coming? Wasn't planned, she managed, extricating herself from his embrace. I need your help, Henry. Tassis' smile faded from his weathered face. What's happened? Rebecca explained the morning's events succinctly, watching Henry's expression darken with each detail. When she mentioned the Dixon name, he cursed quietly under his breath. You always did find trouble, Becca, he said when she'd finished, using the nickname only Thomas and he had ever been allowed to use. Or maybe it finds you. Can you help me? She asked directly. Help you do what exactly? Face down a gang of killers? At our age? He shook his head. I'm not the man I was, Becca. Neither of us are as young as we once were. I'm not asking you to fight my battles, Rebecca said. I need information, routes into Apache Basin that won't be watched, places to observe from without being seen. You know that country better than anyone. Henry ran a hand through his beard, considering. And once you have this information, what then? Rebecca met his gaze steadily. Then I take back what's mine and make sure they never bother me or anyone else again. You're talking about going up against over a dozen armed men, Becca. I'm talking about surviving, she countered. They won't stop with the horses, Henry. Men like that, once they start, they take everything. I'm not leaving the ranch Thomas and I built, and I'm not waiting for them to come back stronger. Henry was silent for a long moment, studying her face. Finally, he nodded. Thomas always said you were the strongest person he'd ever known. Guess he wasn't exaggerating. He moved to a battered desk in the corner, rummaging through a drawer, until he found a folded piece of parchment. I've got maps of the Apache Basin that aren't on any official charts. Prospected up there for years before the silver played out. Rebecca joined him at the desk as he spread out the map. The Dixons have their main camp here, he said, pointing to a mark near a bend in a thin blue line representing a creek. But they've got lookouts posted along these ridges, no way to approach from the main trails without being spotted. His finger traced a faint dotted line that wound through what appeared to be difficult terrain. There's an old Apache trail here, steep, dangerous in places, but it'll get you within half a mile of their camp without crossing any of their likely patrol routes. Rebecca studied the map intently, committing it to memory. What about the mine tunnels Walter mentioned? Henry nodded grimly. Main entrance is here, behind their camp, but there's a ventilation shaft that comes out here. He tapped a spot some distance from the camp. Narrow, but a person could squeeze through if they had to. I'll need more than just maps, Rebecca said quietly. Henry's gaze softened. I know. He straightened, decision made. I'm coming with you. Rebecca started to protest, but he held up a hand. Not to fight. My shooting days are behind me, but I'll guide you in, help you scout. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and my old leg might slow me down, but it hasn't affected my eyesight at all. Relief washed through her. Henry's knowledge would dramatically improve her chances. Thank you, she said simply. Henry refolded the map and handed it to her. Don't thank me yet. This is fool's errand, Becca. But if Thomas were here, he'd be doing the same damn thing, wooden leg or not. He glanced out the livery door toward the brightening day. I'll need an hour to get my gear together. Meet me at the edge of town, North Trail. And Becca? Yes? Bring every bullet you can carry. With the Dixon gang, you'll need them all. The North Trail out of Copper Springs wound through stunted juniper and prickly pear, the land growing increasingly rugged as it climbed toward the foothills. Rebecca arrived first, Mercury's side still heaving slightly from the morning's exertions. She'd purchased a second canteen at Granger's store and made sure the horse drank deeply before continuing. As she waited, Rebecca found her thoughts drifting back to the first time she'd seen these mountains. She'd been just 17, fresh, from Boston, traveling west with her uncle after her parents' death. The stagecoach had labored up these very hills, and she'd pressed her face to the window, marveling at the harsh beauty of a landscape utterly foreign to her New England upbringing. Thomas Harlan had been the station manager at Copper Springs. Then, a young man of 25, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the precise blue of the Arizona sky. He'd helped her down from the coach, their hands touching briefly, and in that moment something had shifted in the universe. 6 months later, they were married. Penny for your thoughts. Rebecca turned to see Henry approaching on a sturdy buckskin, gelding, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. Despite his wooden leg, he sat his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than out of it. Just remembering, she replied. Henry's expression softened. Thomas? She nodded. The first day I arrived, he thought I was the most impractical thing he'd ever seen. City girl in a silk dress with no idea what waited out here. Henry chuckled. Said you'd be on the next stage back to civilization within a week. Never did like admitting he was wrong. A ghost of a smile touched Rebecca's lips. He taught me everything, how to shoot, track, survive. Said the desert doesn't give second chances. He'd be proud of you, Becca. Henry adjusted his hat against the sun and worried sick about what we're about to do. Rebecca checked her saddlebags one last time. I'd rather die standing than live on my knees, Henry. Thomas understood that. She swung back into the saddle. Let's ride. They traveled in comfortable silence for the next hour, the trail gradually narrowing as it climbed higher into the superstitions. The landscape changed subtly, more pine, less cactus, the air growing marginally cooler as they gained elevation. Tell me about the Dixons, Rebecca said finally, breaking the silence. Walter seemed genuinely afraid. Henry's face darkened, with good reason. The Dixons aren't ordinary bandits. Jackson, the older brother, was an officer in the cavalry until 98. Got court-martialed for executing prisoners during the Spanish-American War. Would have hanged if his family hadn't had connections. And Craig, Rebecca asked, recalling the cold eyes of the man who'd threatened her. Different kinds of danger. Jackson's a military man, strategic, disciplined. Craig's a sadist, enjoys hurting people. They complement each other in the worst, impossible way. Henry spat into the dust. Started small, protection rackets in mining towns, stealing horses. Now they control everything from here to the territorial border. Even the Apache gives them a wide berth. Rebecca absorbed this. How many men ride with them? 15, maybe 20. Changes as men die or run afoul of the brothers. Henry shook his head grimly. They've got a code. Betray the Dixons, and they don't just kill you, they kill everyone you've ever cared about. You sound like you know them personally, Rebecca observed. Henry was quiet for a long moment. Jackson Dixon and I served together before his troubles. I knew what he was becoming before most. His voice grew heavy with old regret. Should have. And put a bullet in him then. Might have saved a lot of lives. They created a ridge, and Henry reined in his horse, pointing to a distant cluster of peaks. Apache basins beyond those mountains. We'll camp at Cottonwood Spring tonight, make our approach tomorrow. As they continued, Rebecca considered what she'd learned. These weren't simple bandits she was dealing with, but organized, ruthless men with military training. The odds against her were even worse than she'd feared, but fear wasn't going to protect her ranch or get justice for the violation of her home. Action would. By late afternoon, they reached Cottonwood Spring, a small oasis nestled in a protected hollow. A cluster of ancient cottonwoods surrounded a clear pool fed by an underground spring. The branches offered blessed shade after hours. In the unrelenting sun, Henry dismounted with practiced ease despite his wooden leg, immediately setting about making camp. Rebecca tended to the horses, removing saddles and bridles, making sure they were comfortable before seeing to her own needs. As twilight deepened the shadows, Henry built a small fire, keeping it low to minimize visibility. He pulled a battered coffee pot from his saddlebags and set water to boil. Better eat something substantial, he advised, passing her a package of salt pork and hardtack from his provisions. Tomorrow will test us both. Rebecca accepted the food, realizing suddenly how hungry she was. They ate in companionable silence as the stars emerged overhead, brilliant against the darkening sky. Thomas used to say you could read the heavens like a book, she remarked, staring upward. Henry nodded. Apache taught me. Stars don't just tell you direction, they tell stories if you know how to listen. He pointed to a particular constellation. See that cluster? The Chiricahua call it the Hunter. Follow it east and you'll find the prey. Rebecca studied the stars, trying to see the pattern. Thomas never quite managed to teach me the constellations properly. That's because he was a terrible teacher. Henry chuckled. No patience. I remember when he tried to show you how to track deer, stomping around, cursing when you asked questions. I drove him to distraction, Rebecca admitted with a faint smile. You challenged him, Henry corrected. Made him better. Man was besotted with you from day one. Rebecca felt a familiar ache in her chest, not the sharp pain of fresh grief, but the dull throb of absence that never quite went away. 15 years older than me, and he still went first. Doesn't seem fair. Cancer's never fair, Henry said, softly, then changing the subject. When did you learn to shoot like you described? Taking a man's fingers off at that distance isn't beginner's luck. Rebecca stared into the fire. After the Apache raid in '97, 3 ranches hit in one night, 19 dead. Henry nodded solemnly. I remember. Thomas was away, scouting for the army. I was alone, Rebecca continued, her voice distant with memory. They came at dawn. 2 warriors. I'd never fired at a person before, only targets and games. She fell silent for a moment. When Thomas came home, he saw what had happened. The next day he set up tin cans at different distances, made me practice until I could hit them every time, no matter the conditions. He was right to do so, Henry said. I know. Rebecca looked up from the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames. I've killed before, Henry. Never wanted to, never enjoyed it, but I did what was necessary to survive. And that's what we're doing now, Henry affirmed. Surviving. Rebecca shook her head slowly. No, this is different. Those Dixon brothers, they chose this. They chose to threaten me to take what isn't theirs. Her voice hardened. This isn't just survival. This is justice. Henry studied her for a long moment. Just be sure you know where that line is, Becca, between justice and vengeance. It's thinner than most folks realize. Rebecca didn't answer. As the fire burned down to embers, she unrolled her bedroll and lay back, staring up at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow they would enter Apache Basin, the Dixons' territory. She needed to be clear-headed, focused. But as she drifted towards sleep, it wasn't strategy that occupied her thoughts, but memories. Thomas taught her to shoot, his hands steady on her shoulders as he corrected her stance. Thomas built their ranch house piece by piece, refusing help even when his back ached so badly he could barely stand. Thomas, in their last months together, his once powerful frame wasted by illness, still insisting on sitting on the porch each evening to watch the sunset. "I'll keep what we built safe," she whispered to the stars. "I promise." Morning came with the first tentative calls of desert. Birds. Rebecca woke instantly, years of ranch life having trained her to transition from sleep to full alertness in seconds. Henry was already up, coffee brewing over a small fire. "Thought I'd let you sleep a few more minutes," he said, pouring a cup of the strong black liquid and passing it to her. "We've got a hard day ahead." Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring the bitter warmth. "How far is the Apache Basin from here?" 4 hours, more or less," Henry replied, studying the map spread across his knees. "But we'll stop short and proceed on foot for the last mile. Horses make too much noise, and the territory gets treacherous." They broke camp efficiently, erasing all signs of their presence. By the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains, they were already on the trail, following an ancient Apache path that wound between towering rock formations and across narrow saddles between peaks. As they rode, Henry shared what he knew of Apache Basin and the Dixons' operation. The abandoned mine that served as their headquarters had once been a productive silver operation in the 1880s, before the vein played out. The extensive network of tunnels provided perfect cover for their illegal activities, a place to store stolen horses and goods before moving them across the territorial line. "Jackson runs it like a military operation," Henry explained. "Sentries, patrols, supply lines, that's why they've never been caught." "Well, that and the sheriff's willingness to look the other way." "Sheriff Parker," Rebecca remembered the name Dixon had mentioned. "Is he completely in their pocket?" Henry's expression was grim. His brother-in-law was found hanging from a cottonwood tree 3 days after he arrested one of Dixon's men. Message was pretty clear. Parker takes their money, ignores their activities, and gets to keep breathing. By mid-morning, the landscape had grown increasingly rugged. Massive rock formations rose on either side of the narrow trail, creating natural bottlenecks that would be perfect for ambushes. Rebecca found herself scanning the high ground constantly, watching for any sign of movement. "We're entering their territory now," Henry confirmed, noticing her vigilance. "From here on, we need to assume we're being watched." They dismounted at a small, sheltered hollow, with enough grass for the horses and a trickle of water seeping from between rocks. Henry secured the animals while Rebecca gathered their essential supplies: ammunition, water, food, Thomas's spyglass. "Leave your rifle," Henry advised, strapping on a Bowie knife nearly as long as his forearm. "Too unwieldy for where we're going. Revolver's better." Rebecca nodded, checking her Colt one last time before holstering it. She added a hunting knife to her belt and filled her canteen. "Ready when you are." Henry led the way, moving with surprising agility despite his wooden leg. The path narrowed further, sometimes disappearing altogether as they picked their way through scree slopes and around massive boulders. Twice they froze at the sound of voices carried on the wind, pressing themselves against rock faces until the danger passed. After nearly an hour of careful progress, Henry held up a hand, signaling a stop. They had reached a narrow ledge overlooking a horseshoe-shaped valley. Below them, partially concealed by pine trees, sat the Dixon camp. Rebecca eased forward beside Henry, pulling out Thomas's spyglass to study the scene below. The camp was larger than she'd expected, at least a dozen canvas tents, arranged in a rough circle around a central clearing. Men moved between them with purpose, some cleaning weapons, others tending to horses corralled on the far side of the camp. Near the base of the cliff face, a dark opening marked the entrance to the mine. "More men than usual," Henry muttered, his voice barely audible. "Something's got them stirred up." Rebecca continued scanning the camp, counting. "I make it 17, plus whoever might be inside the mine or out on patrol." "That's our best approach," Henry said, pointing to a narrow ravine that led toward the back of the camp. "Less visibility, and it comes up near the secondary mine entrance I told you about." Rebecca was about to respond when movement near the corral caught her eye. She adjusted the spyglass, focusing on the horses, her breath caught in her throat. "Henry," she whispered, passing him the spyglass. "Look!" Henry peered through the lens, then cursed softly. "Those are your horses, all 5 of them." Rebecca felt a surge of anger. Despite her warning, despite wounding one of their men, the Dixons had returned to her ranch and stolen the horses anyway. While she'd been in town gathering information, they'd circled back, probably with more men, and taken what they wanted. "They must have gone straight back after leaving my place," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Brought reinforcements." Henry nodded grimly. "And they're still at your ranch, most likely. These are just the men assigned to move the horses." A cold knot formed in Rebecca's stomach. "What do you mean?" "Standard Dixon procedure," Henry explained, his expression darkening. "When they target a place, first they take the livestock. Then they come back for everything else." He hesitated. "Then they burn it to the ground. Send a message to anyone else who might resist." Rebecca stared at her stolen horses, then at the bustling camp. What had been a mission to recover her property and teach the Dixons a lesson had suddenly become far more urgent. Her entire life, the ranch she and Thomas had built, their home, everything, was in imminent danger. "We need to move now," she said, her decision made. "Tonight, before they can send riders back to finish the job." Henry studied her face. "That's suicide, Becca. Even if we could somehow get to your horses, we'd never outrun that many men." "I'm not planning to outrun them," Rebecca replied, her voice taking on a steel edge Thomas would have recognized instantly. "I'm planning to stop them for good." Henry's eyes widened as he realized what she was suggesting. "You want to go after Jackson Dixon himself?" Rebecca nodded once, her gaze returning to the camp below. "Cut off the head, and the snake dies." She pointed to a large tent set slightly apart from the others. "That has to be where he stays when he's here. More guards, better position. And if he's not here, if he's already at your ranch, getting ready to burn it down, then we capture Craig," Rebecca said coldly. "One brother for another. Dixon might not care about much, but from what you've told me, he won't abandon his brother." Henry was silent for a long moment, weighing options, considering angles of approach, escape routes. Finally, he sighed. "There might be a way, but it's dangerous and a lot has to go right." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "I'm listening." As Henry began outlining his plan, Rebecca felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there. She wasn't foolish enough to believe this wasn't potentially suicidal, but it was overshadowed by determination. Thomas had always said she had a spine of steel beneath her gentle exterior. Now was the time to prove him right. The Dixons had come to her home, threatened her, stolen from her. They thought a widow alone would be easy prey. By tomorrow they would understand just how wrong they were. The sun dipped behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across Apache Basin. Rebecca and Henry had spent the remainder of the day observing the Dixon camp, tracking patterns of movement, guard rotations, and identifying potential weaknesses. Now, as darkness began to settle over the landscape, the time for action approached. They had relocated to a position closer to the ravine Henry had identified, concealed among a tumble of boulders that offered both cover and a clear view of the southern edge of the camp. Rebecca checked her Colt one final time, then tucked an extra box of ammunition into her jacket pocket. "Remember," Henry whispered, his weathered face half hidden in shadow, "the ventilation shaft is our way in. It's narrow, barely wide enough for a person, but it connects to the main tunnel about 30 yards in." Rebecca nodded, mentally reviewing the crude map Henry had sketched in the dirt. "And you're certain Craig Dixon will be inside?" "If he's here, that's where he'll be this time of evening," Henry confirmed. "Jackson runs things like a military operation, regular reports, planning sessions every night. Craig handles the day-to-day." Rebecca studied the camp below. Activity had slowed as night approached, but lamps were being lit, casting yellow pools of light between the tents. Near the corral, she could see her horses, Domino's distinctive black and white pattern unmistakable even in the fading light. 2 guards patrolled nearby, rifles slung over their shoulders. "What about my horses?" she asked. Henry's expression was grim. "One problem at a time, Becca. We get Craig, we get leverage, then we deal with the horses." She knew he was right, but it galled her to be so close to what was hers and unable to act. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the frustration aside. "Focus on what matters. First steps first." "Let's move," she said, pulling her hat lower over her eyes. They descended the slope, silently, using the deepening shadows for cover. The ravine provided natural concealment, its steep walls blocking line of sight from the main camp. Still, they moved cautiously, freezing at every unusual sound. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they reached the base of the cliff face, where Henry had indicated the ventilation shaft would be located. Rebecca scanned the rocky surface, seeing nothing but natural crevices and stunted vegetation. "There," Henry whispered, pointing to what appeared to be just another shadow among many. As they drew closer, Rebecca saw it, a narrow opening in the rock, barely 2 feet across, partially concealed by scrub brush. Henry pulled the brush aside, revealing the man-made shaft. Cool air flowed from its depths, carrying the musty scent of earth and metal. "I'll go first," he said, already easing himself toward the opening. Rebecca touched his arm. "Your leg is precisely why I should go first," Henry interrupted firmly. "If it gets tight in there, better you're behind to pull me out than ahead where I might trap us both." She couldn't argue with his logic. Henry maneuvered himself into the shaft feet first, his broad shoulders barely clearing the narrow space. For a moment, Rebecca feared he might get stuck, but he continued moving, disappearing inch by inch into the darkness. When only his head and shoulders remained visible, he looked up at her. "Count to 30, then follow. Stay quiet, and if you hear anything unusual, freeze." Rebecca nodded, and Henry vanished completely into the shaft. She counted slowly, using the time to calm her racing heart. Then, taking a deep breath, she lowered herself into the opening. The shaft was even tighter than it had appeared. Rebecca had to turn sideways to fit, her shoulders scraping against rough stone as she descended. The darkness was absolute, forcing her to feel her way forward with her boots and hands. Twice she dislodged small rocks that clattered down the shaft, the sound unnervingly loud in the confined space. After what seemed an eternity, her foot met empty air. She hesitated, then felt Henry's hand grip her ankle, guiding her down. A moment later, she stood beside him, in what felt like a slightly larger space, though still pitch black. "Tunnel junction," Henry breathed, his voice barely audible. "Main passage is this way." He led her forward, one hand keeping contact with the rock wall, the other holding hers to keep them connected in the darkness. Rebecca could hear their footsteps. Despite their care, the sound seeming to echo endlessly through the mine tunnels. Gradually, a faint glow appeared ahead, light from the main section of the mine. Henry slowed, then stopped completely, pressing back against the tunnel wall. Rebecca followed suit, listening intently. Voices echoed from somewhere ahead, too distant to make out words, but clear enough to indicate at least two men in conversation. The light grew marginally brighter as they waited, suggesting someone with a lantern was moving closer to their position. Henry squeezed her hand once, their prearranged signal to stay put, then released it and moved forward alone, his footsteps now completely silent despite his wooden leg. Rebecca held her breath, straining to see in the dim light. Henry's figure was barely visible as he reached the tunnel's bend, peering carefully around the corner. He returned a moment later, his mouth close to her ear. Two guards at the main junction, 20 yards ahead. Beyond them, a larger chamber where they're holding some meetings. I can hear Craig's voice. "Can we get past the guards?" Rebecca whispered. Henry's face was grim in the faint light. Not without raising the alarm. They're playing cards, but they're alert. Rebecca considered their options. Their plan had hinged on reaching Craig undetected, using the element of surprise. A direct confrontation risked bringing the entire camp down on them. What about another route? She asked. These mines usually have multiple tunnels. Henry shook his head. We don't have time to explore. If we can't get past those guards, we need another approach entirely. Rebecca thought quickly, remembering the layout of the camp they'd observed. The main entrance, how heavily guarded was it? 2 men outside, probably more just inside, Henry replied. Why? What if we created a distraction? She suggested. Something to draw attention away from both entrances, long enough for us to slip in. Henry was quiet for a moment, considering. The corral, he said finally. If those horses got loose, especially in the dark. Every man in camp would scramble to catch them, Rebecca finished, including the guards. It's risky, Henry warned. If they spot you near the corral, they won't, Rebecca said with quiet confidence. I've been working with horses since before you met me, Henry. I can spook them without being seen. He studied her face in the dim light, then nodded once. All right. We go back out the way we came. Circle around to the corral. You create your distraction, and we use the chaos to slip in through the main entrance. They retraced their path through the narrow tunnel, the return journey seeming faster now that they knew the route. Emerging from the ventilation shaft felt like breaking the surface after being underwater. The cool night air, a relief after the stifling confines of the mine. They circled the camp at a safe distance, using the rugged terrain for cover. The corral was located on the northern edge, partially sheltered by a stand of pines. As they drew closer, Rebecca could see her 5 horses among the 20 or so others. Domino's distinctive coloring, easy to spot even in the darkness. I need a clear path to the mine entrance once the horses are loose, she whispered, scanning the area between the corral and the main camp. Henry pointed to a depression that ran roughly parallel to the eastern edge of the camp. That wash leads almost directly to the mine. Stay low, move fast when the time comes. Rebecca nodded, then slipped off her boots, tying them together by the laces and hanging them around her neck. Quieter this way, she explained. Seeing Henry's questioning look, she moved forward alone, padding silently toward the corral on stockinged feet. The darkness worked in her favor, allowing her to slip between shadows, undetected. 2 guards patrolled nearby, but their attention was focused outward, watching for threats approaching the camp, not for someone already inside their perimeter. Rebecca reached the corral fence and crouched low, assessing the situation. The horses were mostly calm, a few moving restlessly in the confined space. Domino stood slightly apart from the others, head raised as if sensing her presence. She needed a distraction big enough to scatter the horses, but controlled enough not to attract immediate suspicion. Fire was too risky and too permanent. Gunshots would bring every man in camp running, but for the wrong reason. Then she spotted it, a metal bucket hanging from a post near the corral gate, likely used for water or feed. If thrown with enough force against the wooden fence. Rebecca waited for the guards to complete another circuit, noting the timing of their patrol. When both men were at their furthest point from her position, she made her move, slipping to the gatepost and lifting the bucket from its hook. Taking careful aim at the opposite side of the corral, she threw the bucket with all her strength. It struck the wooden rails with a tremendous clang, then clattered to the ground with a series of metallic impacts that shattered the night's silence. The effect was instantaneous. The horses reared and whinnied in panic, led by Domino, who seemed to understand instinctively what Rebecca intended. The powerful paint stallion charged the fence where the bucket had struck, crashing into it with his shoulder. Already weakened from the impact, the rails splintered under his weight. Chaos erupted. Horses poured through the broken fence, scattering in all directions. The guards shouted in alarm, running toward the corral, but having to dodge the stampeding animals. More shouts came from the main camp as men emerged from tents, trying to make sense of the commotion. Rebecca didn't wait to see more. She darted along the path Henry had indicated, staying low and moving fast. The wash provided perfect cover, its depth keeping her below line of sight as she approached the mine entrance. Henry was waiting for her at the rendezvous point, crouched behind a boulder 30 yards from the mine's mouth. "Perfect timing," he murmured as she joined him. "The entrance guards just left to help with the horses." They moved quickly toward the mine, the sounds of confusion from the camp covering any noise they made. The entrance was a black rectangle cut into the cliff face, its wooden support beams barely visible in the darkness. Inside, lanterns hung at intervals along the main tunnel, casting pools of yellow light separated by regions of shadow. They moved, from shadow to shadow, pausing to listen for any sound of approaching footsteps. The tunnel widened as they progressed, eventually opening into a larger chamber partially divided by support columns. Crates and barrels lined the walls, supplies, stolen goods, or worse. Ahead, light spilled from a side chamber, along with the murmur of voices. Rebecca and Henry exchanged a glance, then crept forward, staying close to the rough-hewn wall. As they neared the lighted chamber, words became distinguishable. "Can't afford another delay," a harsh voice was saying. "Jackson wants those horses across the border by Friday." "What about the woman?" another voice asked. "The widow." The first voice, which Rebecca now recognized as Craig Dixon's, laughed. "Jackson's handling her personally, said he wants to make an example." Rebecca felt a chill run through her. They were talking about her ranch, her life, with the casual indifference of men discussing the weather. "When?" the second voice pressed. "Tomorrow night," Craig replied. "Full moon, good visibility. We'll hit the place hard, take anything worth selling, burn the rest. By the time anyone notices the smoke, we'll be long gone." Henry placed a restraining hand on Rebecca's arm, feeling her tense beside him. She nodded once, acknowledging the silent warning. Acting on emotion now would get them both killed. They edged closer to the chamber entrance, careful to stay out of the light. Peering around the corner, Rebecca saw Craig Dixon seated at a rough wooden table, a map spread before him. Two other men stood nearby. One the young man called Ryan, whom she'd encountered at her ranch, the other a stranger with a scarred face and an elaborate walrus mustache. "What about Parker?" the mustached man asked. "The sheriff's been getting nervous lately. Mentioned federal marshals asking questions." Craig waved a dismissive hand. "Parker knows what happens to people who cross us. He'll keep his mouth shut." He jabbed a finger at the map. "We'll take this route through Rattlesnake Canyon. It adds half a day, but it's less likely to be watched." Rebecca had seen enough. She drew back, meeting Henry's gaze. The plan had been to capture Craig, use him as leverage against his brother. But now, knowing what they intended for her ranch, knowing it would happen tomorrow night. The calculations changed. "We need to warn the ranch," she whispered. "Get back before they do." Henry nodded grimly. "But we can't let them know we overheard. If they change their plans—" The decision crystallized in Rebecca's mind with sudden clarity. They couldn't capture Craig, not without risking everything. But they could slow the Dixon operation down, buy themselves time to prepare. "The horses," she murmured. "If they lose the stolen stock, they'll have to regroup." Henry's eyes widened as he understood. "Risky," he breathed. Rebecca's expression hardened. "So I'm doing nothing." Before Henry could respond, footsteps echoed from the main tunnel, someone approaching rapidly. Rebecca and Henry pressed themselves into a shadowed alcove, barely breathing, as a figure hurried past them toward the lighted chamber. "Boss!" the newcomer called, his voice urgent. "Someone spooked the horses. They've scattered all over the valley." Craig Dixon's curse was audible even from their hiding place. "How many got away?" "Most of them," the man reported. "The boys are trying to round them up, but it's dark and they're panicking." "Find them!" Craig shouted. "Every last one, and post extra guards. This was no accident." The urgency in Dixon's voice confirmed what Rebecca already suspected. The stolen horses were crucial to their operation. Losing them, even temporarily, would disrupt their plans. "We need to go," Henry whispered. "Now, while they're distracted." They retreated the way they'd come, moving swiftly through the shadows between lanterns. The main tunnel was empty, everyone apparently having joined the effort to recapture the horses. Outside, the camp was in disarray. Men on foot chased horses in every direction, lanterns bobbing like fireflies across the valley floor. Shouts and curses filled the night air, punctuated by the thunder of hooves as the animals continued their flight. Rebecca and Henry used the confusion to make their escape, slipping past the perimeter unnoticed and climbing back into the ravine that had granted them access. Only when they had put considerable distance between themselves and the camp did they pause to catch their breath. "Will they catch the horses?" Rebecca asked, lacing her boots back on. Henry shook his head. "Some, not all. Certainly not tonight. And without the full shipment, they'll have to adjust their plans, buying us time to get back to the ranch," Rebecca concluded. "And decide how to handle Jackson Dixon when he arrives," Henry added grimly. Rebecca gazed back toward the chaos they'd left behind, satisfaction mingling with the knowledge that they'd only won a small skirmish in a larger war. "But it was a start. Let's go get our horses," she said, rising to her feet. "We have a lot of ground to cover before dawn." As they moved through the darkness toward the hollow where they'd left their mounts, Rebecca's mind was already racing ahead. The Dixons were planning to destroy everything she and Thomas had built, to erase their life's work in a single night of violence. Not if she had anything to say about it. The journey back to Cottonwood Spring felt interminable, each minute stretching, as Rebecca's mind raced with what they had learned. The Dixons' plans were now clear. They intended to strip her ranch bare, then burn it to the ground as a message to others who might resist their control of the territory. "You're thinking too loud," Henry commented, as they retrieved their horses. From the hidden hollow, the animals nickered softly in recognition, eager to be moving after hours of forced stillness. Rebecca tightened Mercury's cinch strap with quick, efficient movements. "Sorry," she murmured, though her tone suggested she was anything but. "Just calculating how much time we have." Henry checked his saddlebags, ensuring nothing had been disturbed. In their absence, if they stick to their plan, tomorrow night, but after what happened with their horses, they might accelerate things. "Or delay them," Rebecca countered, swinging into the saddle. "They lost valuable stock tonight. They'll need to recover, regroup." Henry mounted his buckskin with a grimace, his wooden leg making the movement awkward despite years of practice. "Jackson Dixon isn't the type to change course easily. Military mindset. Once he sets a target, he commits. They set off at a steady pace, traveling by moonlight through the treacherous mountain paths. A direct route back to Rebecca's ranch would take them too close to known Dixon territory. Instead, they would circle wide around Apache Basin, adding hours to their journey, but reducing the risk of encounter. "Tell me more about Jackson," Rebecca said after they had ridden in silence for some time. "You served with him. What kind of man is he?" Henry's face was grim in the moonlight. "The kind who believes in absolute control. Every detail planned, every contingency accounted for. Wasn't always that way. War changed him like it changes most men. But with Jackson, it stripped away whatever humanity he had to begin with." "And the court-martial?" Henry sighed deeply. "Philippines. Our unit was assigned to pacify a village suspected of harboring insurgents. Standard procedure was to question the locals, try to gather intelligence. Jackson decided that was inefficient, lined up the village elders and executed them one by one to encourage cooperation from the rest." Rebecca absorbed this in silence, the implications settling like a cold weight in her stomach. This was the man planning to destroy her home, her life. "He'll come himself," Henry continued, anticipating her unspoken question. "Jackson doesn't delegate important operations, and he'll bring enough men to ensure success." "How many?" "6, maybe 8, plus Craig, if he's recovered from tonight's disruption." Rebecca did the mental calculation. 10 armed men, possibly more against her and Henry. The odds were not in their favor by any conventional measure. "We'll need help," she said finally. Henry gave a humorless laugh. "Not much available in these parts. Sheriff's in their pocket. Most ranchers will shut their doors if they hear the Dixons are on the warpath." "What about in Copper Springs? There must be someone?" "Maybe," Henry interrupted, his tone suggesting he'd already considered and dismissed this option. "Problem. Is anyone willing to stand against the Dixons is either already dead or smart enough to hide that willingness." They lapsed into silence again. The only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves on the rocky trail and the occasional cry of a night bird. Rebecca's mind worked furiously, examining and discarding potential strategies. The Dixons held every advantage: numbers, firepower, the element of surprise. All she had was knowledge of their plans and the home ground. It would have to be enough by the time they reached Cottonwood Spring. The first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky. Both riders and horses were exhausted from the night's exertions, but Rebecca knew they couldn't afford to rest long. 2 hours, she decided as they dismounted. "We let the horses recover, grab some sleep, then push for home." Henry nodded too. Tired to argue. They cared for the animals first, ensuring they had water and what little grazing was available before seeing to their own needs. Rebecca forced herself to eat some jerky and hardtack, knowing she would need the energy, though fatigue had dulled her appetite. Sleep came in fitful bursts, her mind too active to fully surrender to exhaustion. Images from the Dixon camp kept intruding. Craig's casual discussion of destroying her ranch, the stolen horses, the knowledge that in less than 24 hours, armed men would descend on her home with the intent to erase everything she had built. When Henry shook her awake, it felt as though she had barely closed her eyes. But the position of the sun told her their agreed rest period had indeed passed. "You were talking in your sleep," Henry remarked as they prepared to depart. Rebecca splashed water from the spring onto her face, trying to clear the fog of fatigue. "Saying what?" "Thomas's name, mostly." Henry's weathered face softened. "He'd be proud of you, you know, standing your ground like this." Rebecca didn't respond immediately, busying herself with securing her bedroll to Mercury's saddle. "He'd have told me to sell the ranch and move to town," she said finally. "Always said I was too stubborn for my own good." Henry chuckled. "True enough, but he'd have stood with you anyway, just like he always did." They set off as the morning heat began to build, following a different route from the one they had taken, to reach Apache Basin. This path would take them through Rattlesnake Canyon, ironically, the same route the Dixons had planned to use for moving the stolen horses. "If we push hard, we can reach your ranch by mid-afternoon," Henry calculated as they rode. "That gives us until nightfall to prepare." Rebecca nodded, already mentally inventorying what resources she had available. The ranch house was solidly built with thick adobe walls that could withstand some punishment. The barn and corral were more vulnerable, but less critical to defend. Ammunition was limited, what she carried plus whatever remained in the house. Not nearly enough for a prolonged firefight. They would need to be smarter than that. "I've been thinking," she said after they had ridden for nearly an hour, "about what you said regarding Jackson Dixon's military mindset." Henry glanced at her, interest piqued. "Go on." "Men like that, they expect resistance to follow a certain pattern. They plan for it, counter it before it happens." Rebecca's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "What if we don't give him the fight he's expecting?" "What kind of fight is he expecting?" "A defensive one. Us, barricaded in the ranch house trying to hold out against superior numbers." She met Henry's gaze. "But what if we're not there when he arrives?" Henry considered this, understanding dawning in his eyes. "An ambush," Rebecca nodded. "He'll come expecting to find a frightened widow and maybe a few hands. Instead, we control when and where the confrontation happens." "It's risky," Henry cautioned. "If they split their forces, if they approach from multiple directions, then we adjust," Rebecca said firmly. "But Jackson's arrogance works in our favor. He won't expect a woman to take the offensive, especially not on his terms." Henry's expression shifted to one of grudging admiration. "Thomas always said you were the strategist between you two." "I learned from necessity," Rebecca replied simply. "When you're always outnumbered, you learn to fight smarter, not harder." As they continued through the rugged terrain, the plan began to take shape between them. The natural features around the ranch, the dry wash that ran along the eastern boundary, the rocky outcropping to the north, the dense mesquite thicket west of the house, all offered potential advantages if used correctly. By the time they emerged from Rattlesnake Canyon into more open country, Rebecca felt the first stirrings of hope. The odds were still heavily against them, but with careful preparation and the element of surprise, they might stand a chance. Then Henry reined in sharply, raising a hand in warning. Rebecca pulled Mercury to a halt beside him, instantly alert. "Riders," Henry said quietly, pointing to a dust cloud visible in the distance, moving perpendicular to their path. "Coming from the direction of your ranch." Rebecca squinted against the harsh sunlight. The riders were too far away to identify, but they were moving with purpose, following the main trail that led from her property toward Copper Springs. "How many?" she asked, though she could make a reasonable guess from the size of the dust cloud. 4, maybe 5, Henry estimated. "Scout party, most likely. Dixon sending men ahead to assess the situation before the main force arrives." A cold determination settled in Rebecca's chest. "Then they've already been to my ranch." "Probable," Henry agreed grimly. "Checking defenses, looking for easy approaches, standard reconnaissance." Rebecca's hand moved unconsciously to the Colt, at her hip. 5 men, now between them and her home. If they engaged, they might eliminate some of the threat they would face later, but at the cost of revealing their presence and losing the element of surprise. "We avoid them," she decided, reluctantly. "Circle around, approach the ranch from the south. If they've already scouted the property, they won't be back until the main force arrives." Henry nodded approval. "Smart. Preserve your advantage." They altered course, adding precious time to their journey, but maintaining the secrecy of their return. As they rode, Rebecca's thoughts turned increasingly to the coming confrontation. The Dixon gang had violated her home twice now, first stealing her horses, then sending men to scout her ranch in preparation for a full assault. The invasion of her space, the place she had built with Thomas, filled her with a cold fury that transcended fear. They reached the southern boundary of her property in the late afternoon, approaching cautiously through a stretch of scrubland that offered some cover. From this vantage point, the ranch house was visible in the distance, a solid adobe structure. With a wide porch, smoke still rising from the chimney. "Someone's there," Henry observed, his voice tight with concern. Rebecca studied the scene, noting details that were wrong. The corral gate stood open, something she would never have allowed. A horse she didn't recognize was hitched to the porch rail, and the smoke from the chimney was too thick, too dark for a cooking fire. "They've left someone behind," she concluded. "A watcher, to alert them if I return." Henry frowned. "Changes things. We can't prepare properly with hostile eyes on us." Rebecca considered their options. The presence of a Dixon man complicated matters, but also offered potential advantages. "He'll have a horse, probably good stock." "You're thinking of capturing him," Henry guessed, reading her intent. "Using his horse as a replacement for one of your stolen ones, and getting information," Rebecca added, "about how many will be coming tonight, what their approach will be." The sun was lowering toward the western mountains, the light turning golden as afternoon began its transition to evening. They had perhaps 3 hours until nightfall, when Jackson Dixon and his men would likely make their move. "We need to handle this carefully," Henry cautioned. "If he manages to get off a warning shot—" Rebecca's expression hardened. "He won't. They left their horses concealed in a dry wash, approaching the ranch on foot to minimize the chance of detection." Rebecca led the way, moving with the silent efficiency of someone intimately familiar with the terrain. Every depression, every cluster of brush, every rocky outcropping on her property was known to her, and she used them now to advantage. As they drew closer, additional details became apparent. The watcher had made himself comfortable on her porch, sitting in Thomas's old rocking chair with a rifle across his knees. A bottle stood on the small table beside him, her bottle taken from her own kitchen. The casual violation of her home stoked the anger simmering in her chest. "Circle around to the back," she instructed Henry. "There's a window to the kitchen. It sticks sometimes, but it should open. I'll approach from the front. Keep his attention focused on me." Henry grimaced. "Putting yourself at risk." "He won't be expecting me," Rebecca countered. "And he's been drinking. His reactions will be slow." After a moment's hesitation, Henry nodded reluctantly. "Be careful. If anything goes wrong—" "It won't," Rebecca assured him with more confidence than she felt. They separated, Henry skirting the edge of the property to approach from the rear, while Rebecca continued her cautious advance toward the front of the house. The watcher appeared half asleep in the rocking chair, lulled by boredom and alcohol. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, the rifle resting loosely in his lap. Rebecca recognized him as the young one called Ryan, the same man who had helped Craig Dixon try to steal her horses the previous day. Barely more than a boy, with his patchy attempt at a beard, but old enough to ride with killers and thieves. She waited until she was certain Henry had reached his position at the rear of the house before making her move. Drawing her Colt, she emerged from cover and crossed the open yard with swift, silent steps, mounting the porch before Ryan registered her presence. The creak of a floorboard finally alerted him. His head snapped up, eyes widening in shock as he found himself staring into the barrel of Rebecca's revolver. "Don't," she said softly as his hand moved toward his rifle. "You'll be dead before your finger touches the trigger." Ryan froze, fear replacing the initial surprise in his young face. You're supposed to be gone," he stammered, disappointed. Rebecca kept the Colt steady, her voice cold. "Hands where I can see them. Slowly." The young man complied, raising his hands to shoulder height. "Look, Mrs. Harlan, I'm just doing what I was told." "Save it," Rebecca cut him off. "Inside, now." She backed him into the house, keeping a safe distance between them. The interior was as she had left it, though she noted with mounting anger that someone had gone through her possessions. Drawers stood partially open, items moved from their usual places. Henry was waiting just inside, his own revolver drawn. "Sit," he ordered Ryan, gesturing to a chair at the kitchen table. The young man obeyed, his earlier bravado entirely evaporated in the face of unexpected resistance. Rebecca kept him covered while Henry efficiently bound his hands behind him with a length of rope from the kitchen. "Now," Rebecca said once he was secured, "you're going to tell us exactly what Jackson Dixon is planning for tonight." Ryan's eyes darted between them, calculating his options, and apparently finding them limited. "I don't know anything about tonight." Henry cuffed him sharply across the back of the head. "Try again, boy. We know Dixon's planning to hit this ranch. We know he sent you and others to scout it. Stop wasting our time." Fear loosened Ryan's tongue. All right. Jackson's bringing 8 men. They're coming at midnight, approaching from the east along the dry wash. Figure you'd be asleep by then, if you were even here." He swallowed hard. "I was supposed to signal if you came back." "And have you?" Rebecca demanded. Ryan shook his head. "Didn't get the chance, did I?" Rebecca exchanged a glance with Henry. If the young man was telling the truth, Dixon would be proceeding with his original plan, unaware that the element of surprise was lost. "What else?" Henry pressed. "What exactly are his orders?" Ryan's face paled slightly. "Take anything valuable. Horses, if any are left, supplies, then burn the rest." He hesitated, then added reluctantly, "Jackson said if you were here, we were to make an example. Said no one defies the Dixons without consequences." The cold matter-of-factness with which he described the planned destruction of her home and possibly her life sent a chill through Rebecca. These men didn't see her as a person, just an obstacle to be removed, a point to be made to others who might resist their control. "Where's Craig?" she asked, remembering the wounded man from their first encounter. "Back at camp," Ryan answered, "still organizing the men after what happened with the horses, most scattered all over the basin. We have only recovered about half so far." This confirmed what Rebecca had hoped. Their action at the Dixon camp had indeed disrupted the gang's operations, dividing their forces and attention. "And Jackson?" Henry inquired. "He's leading this raid personally?" Ryan nodded. "Said this one was special, personal-like." Rebecca frowned. "Personal? Why?" "I've never even met the man." "Don't know," Ryan admitted, "but he seemed real intent on handling this himself. Said something about settling old debts." Henry and Rebecca exchanged puzzled glances. Whatever old debts Jackson Dixon thought he was settling, they had no knowledge of them. "What do we do with him?" Henry asked, nodding toward their captive. Rebecca considered their options. They couldn't release him. He would alert Dixon immediately. Keeping him at the ranch during what promised to be a violent confrontation was equally problematic. "The root cellar," she decided. "It's secure, and he won't be in the line of fire if things get messy." Henry nodded approval. "His horse? We'll keep it. Might need the extra mount." Rebecca turned her attention back to Ryan. "One last question. The men coming with Jackson tonight, who are they? I want names, descriptions." Ryan hesitated, loyalty warring with self-preservation. Self-preservation won. "Besides Jackson, there's Mason, the one you shot. His hands all wrapped up, but he insisted on coming. I want payback." He swallowed. "Then there's Blackie Willis, a former cavalry like Jackson, mean as a snake. The Taylor brothers, Sam and Elliot, good with knives. A Mexican fella called Diaz, who never talks. And 2 new guys I don't know well, Anderson and somebody called the Swede." Rebecca committed the names to memory, trying to match them with faces she had glimpsed at the Dixon camp. Knowledge of her enemies might make the difference between survival and death in the coming hours. "That's enough for now," she said, gesturing, for Henry to move their prisoner. Let's get him secured, then we have preparations to make. As Henry led Ryan toward the trapdoor that accessed the root cellar, Rebecca took a moment to truly look at her home. The solid walls Thomas had built with his own hands, the hearth where they had shared countless meals, the rocking chair on the porch where he had taught her to clean a rifle and mend a saddle. Tonight, Jackson Dixon intended to erase all of it, to burn her memories along with the physical structure that housed them. To make her a cautionary tale for others who might defy his authority, she chambered around in her Colt, the sound sharp and final in the quiet house. He would find her waiting. With Ryan secured in the root cellar, Rebecca and Henry set about, transforming the ranch house into a defensible position. Furniture was rearranged to create barricades. Windows were reinforced with wooden shutters Thomas had built years ago for the occasional desert storm. Henry inventoried their ammunition, while Rebecca retrieved additional weapons from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. Thomas always said to prepare for the worst, she explained, as she lifted out a second revolver and a box of shells. Henry examined the hidden cache with appreciation. Smart man. What else do you have in there? Rebecca reached deeper into the compartment, producing a small, leather-bound journal. His records, everything he ever learned about the people and places in this territory. She hesitated, then added, including notes on his time as sheriff. Henry's head snapped up. What did you say? Before we built this place, Thomas was sheriff of Copper Springs for 7 years. Rebecca frowned at Henry's reaction. You knew that, didn't you? Henry sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, his expression troubled. I knew he'd been a lawman, but not where. We didn't talk much about the past. He reached for the journal. May I? Rebecca handed it over, watching as Henry flipped through the pages with increasing urgency, as if searching for something specific. He stopped suddenly, his weather-beaten face paling as he read. What is it? Rebecca asked. Henry looked up, his eyes haunted. When exactly did Thomas serve as sheriff? From 88 to 95, Rebecca answered, growing concerned. Henry, what's wrong? Jackson Dixon, Henry said quietly. Look at this entry. Rebecca took the journal, focusing on the page Henry indicated. Thomas's neat handwriting filled the margins. October 12, 1894, sentenced Jacob and Jackson Dixon to 5 years territorial prison for armed robbery of Weaver's freight. Recovered most stolen goods. Younger brother, Craig, released due to age. 16 with warning. She stared at the words, the implications settling like a stone in her stomach. Thomas put Jackson Dixon in prison, and now Dixon's come to settle the score, Henry concluded grimly. That's the personal business Ryan mentioned. Rebecca sank into the chair by the window, mind racing. But why now, after all these years? Dixon's been in the area for 3 years? He must have heard Thomas passed, decided it was time to eliminate the last connection. Henry's expression darkened. The horses were just the beginning. What he really wants is to erase Thomas's legacy. Completely. Me, Rebecca said softly, and everything we built. Henry nodded soberly. Dixon's the type to nurse a grudge for decades. Prison would have only hardened that. Rebecca processed this revelation, feeling the stakes rise even higher. This wasn't just about horses or territory or sending a message to others who might resist. This was personal vengeance, a vendetta against her husband that had transferred to her when Thomas died. She stood abruptly, the initial shock giving way to renewed determination. This changes nothing about what we need to do. If anything, it makes our task clearer. Henry studied her face. Dixon won't stop, you understand that? Even if we fight him off tonight, he'll come back again and again, until he gets what he wants. Then we make sure he doesn't walk away from tonight, Rebecca replied, her voice steady. We end this, once and for all. As sunset painted the western Sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Rebecca and Henry finalized their preparations. The original plan, to set an ambush outside the ranch, had been modified in light of their new understanding of Dixon's motivations. "He wants to destroy the house personally," Rebecca reasoned. "Make a show of it, he'll come close," Henry agreed. "But he'll send men ahead to clear the way. We need to thin their numbers before they reach the house." They studied the layout of the property, identifying choke points and potential fields of fire. The dry wash Ryan had mentioned would indeed provide cover for an approach from the east, but it also created a natural funnel that could work to their advantage. "If we place charges here and here," Henry suggested, indicating points along the wash, "we could create enough confusion to split their force." Rebecca considered this. Decades of ranching had given her a steady supply of blasting powder, used for clearing rocks and stumps when expanding the property. Now that same powder would serve a deadlier purpose. "What about light?" she asked. "They'll be coming in darkness, using it for cover." Henry smiled thinly. "That works both ways." Hard to see an ambush in the dark. They continued planning as night fell, their preparations taking on an urgency that left little room for fear or doubt. By the time the moon rose, casting silver light across the yard, the ranch had been transformed from a vulnerable homestead into a carefully laid trap. Rebecca stood on the porch, watching the moonlight creep across the landscape, transforming familiar terrain into a ghostly, alien topography. Henry joined her, offering a freshly filled cup of coffee. "We should rest while we can," he advised. "Take shifts." Still several hours before midnight, Rebecca nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily. "I'll take my first watch. You've been pushing that leg of yours too hard." Henry didn't argue, recognizing the truth in her words. As he turned to go inside, he paused. "Becca, there's something I need to say. In case things don't go as planned." "Save it for sunrise," she interrupted, not looking at him. "We'll have plenty of time for talk when this is over." He studied her profile for a moment, then nodded and disappeared into the house. Rebecca remained on the porch, sipping her coffee and listening to the night sounds of the desert. An owl called from somewhere near the barn. Wind rustled through the mesquite. Familiar sounds of home that might soon be silenced forever. Almost unconsciously, her hand moved to the wedding band she still wore on a chain around her neck. Thomas had placed it on her finger 30 years ago, promising to protect and cherish her for all his days. Now she would protect what remained of their life together, or die in the attempt. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Rebecca and Henry switched positions twice, each taking the opportunity to rest without truly sleeping. Shortly after 11, they made a final check of their preparations and took up their initial positions. Henry would man the barn roof, providing elevated coverage with Thomas's Winchester. Rebecca positioned herself behind a stone wall that bordered her garden, offering a clear view of the approach from the wash, while keeping her close enough to fall back to the house if necessary. Midnight approached. The full moon hung high overhead, bathing the landscape in silvery light that created sharp contrasts between illumination and shadow. Perfect conditions for an ambush from either side. Rebecca checked her Colt one final time, ensuring each chamber was loaded, then settled in to wait. Her senses seemed heightened by the tension, registering every rustle of wind through grass, every distant cry of a night predator. The first sign of approach came not as a sound, but as an absence, a momentary silencing of the night creatures that had been calling in the distance. Rebecca tensed, eyes scanning the eastern perimeter, where the dry wash cut across her property. Movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from deeper darkness, advancing cautiously toward the ranch house. Not along the wash as expected, but from the south, using a line of scrub brush for cover, a scout moving ahead of the main force. Rebecca remained motionless, fighting the urge to engage. Their plan depended on drawing in the entire group, not alerting them with premature resistance. She watched as the figure reached the edge of the yard, pausing to survey the seemingly peaceful ranch house. More movement from the east now, multiple figures emerging from the wash, advancing in a practiced formation that spoke of military training. Through her field glasses, Rebecca counted 6 men, with another 2 approaching from the south. 8 in total, just as Ryan had indicated. No sign yet of Jackson Dixon himself. The men converged at the edge of the open ground surrounding the house, maintaining disciplined silence. A tall figure Rebecca identified as likely being the one Ryan had called Blackie Willis, gestured for the others to spread out, creating a loose cordon around the property. Still, Rebecca waited, pulse quickening but hands steady on her revolver. They needed the raiders fully committed to the attack, positioned where the carefully laid traps could do maximum damage. A sharp whistle cut through the night, the signal for the Dixon men to advance. As they moved forward with practiced coordination, a 9th figure emerged from the shadows of the wash. Even at a distance, something in his bearing marked him as different, an authority that needed no announcement. Jackson Dixon had arrived. Rebecca tensed, mentally counting down. 3, 2, 1. The night exploded. The first charge, buried. At the mouth of the wash, detonated with a thunderous roar, sending dirt and stone fragments flying in all directions. 2 of Dixon's men went down immediately, caught in the blast radius. A second later, another explosion rocked the northern perimeter, exactly where Henry had predicted some of the force would move to flank the house. Confusion erupted among the attackers. Several dropped for cover, while others fired blindly toward the house, unsure where the threat originated. Through the chaos, Rebecca saw Jackson Dixon remain standing, barking orders that were lost in the din of gunfire and secondary explosions as smaller charges ignited. Henry's rifle cracked from the barn roof, the shot dropping one of the raiders who had broken cover to run for the house. The remaining Dixon men scattered, seeking whatever protection the open yard offered, precious little by design. Now Rebecca joined the fight, firing carefully selected shots at the men pinned down by the explosions and Henry's covering fire. She dropped one, then another, the Colt bucking in her hands with familiar authority. But Jackson Dixon had not survived this long by panicking in a crisis. Even as his men were being systematically eliminated, he analyzed the situation with cold efficiency. Spotting Henry's position on the barn roof, he fired 3 rapid shots from his rifle. Rebecca watched in horror as Henry jerked backward, then slumped out of sight behind the barn's ridgeline. Whether he was hit or simply taking cover, she couldn't tell. No time to worry about that now. Dixon was rallying his remaining men, 3 by Rebecca's count, organizing them for a concentrated assault on the house. She needed to move, to reach her secondary position before they closed in. She slipped away from the garden wall, using the lingering smoke from the explosions as additional cover. Her path took her behind the corral, then along the shadow of the barn. She risked a glance upward as she passed, but could see no sign of Henry. Inside the barn, she paused to catch her breath and check her ammunition. 4 shots fired, 2 remaining in the cylinder. She reloaded quickly, ears straining for sounds of approach. Footsteps crunched on the packed earth outside, someone approaching. The barn! Rebecca melted into the shadows behind a stack of hay bales, Colt raised and ready. The door creaked open, and a figure slipped inside, one of Dixon's men, rifle held at the ready. He moved cautiously, checking corners, obviously aware he might be walking into a trap. Rebecca recognized him from Ryan's description. Diaz, the silent Mexican. She waited until he had moved fully into the barn, his back partially turned as he scanned the loft area. Her first shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second, placed with practiced precision, dropped him where he stood. The shots would give away her position, but that was part of the plan. Draw them in, separate them, reduce the odds. Rebecca was already moving to her next location, exiting through the barn's rear door and circling toward the house. 2 more explosions rocked the night, the final charges they had placed along the likely approach routes. Someone screamed in pain. The sound quickly cut short. 3 down, perhaps 4. But still no sign of Dixon himself. Rebecca reached the back porch of the house, slipping inside through the kitchen door they had left unlocked for this purpose. The interior was dark, exactly as they had planned it. Anyone entering would be silhouetted against the moonlight, while she remained hidden in the deeper shadows. Gunfire erupted from the direction of the barn, multiple shots in rapid succession. Rebecca's heart clenched. Has Henry been found, or had he recovered enough to engage another of Dixon's men? No time to wonder. Heavy footsteps approached the front of the house. Multiple sets, at least 2 people. The front door crashed open, wood splintering as someone kicked it in. "Harlan!" a voice called, commanding, cold, filled with a fury that transcended the years. "Show yourself!" Jackson Dixon had entered the house. Rebecca remained motionless in the shadows of the kitchen, listening as 2 sets of footsteps moved through the front room. One paused, while the other continued deeper into the house. "Search every room," Dixon ordered. "She's here somewhere." The second man moved toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Rebecca let him pass the kitchen entrance, then stepped out behind him. Her shot caught him at the base of the skull, dropping him instantly. Dixon whirled at the sound, firing. In her direction, the bullet splintered the doorframe as Rebecca ducked back into the kitchen. "Mrs. Harlan," Dixon called, his voice controlled despite the circumstances. "I've waited a long time for this meeting." Rebecca pressed her back against the wall beside the kitchen door, Colt ready. "Seems you had a grudge against my husband." A harsh laugh. "Your husband was a self-righteous bastard who cost me 5 years of my life. Him and that wooden-legged partner of his." Rebecca froze. Henry had never mentioned any involvement in Dixon's arrest. Yet another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Henry and Thomas had worked together to bring down the Dixon brothers all those years ago. "Henry Blackwood," Dixon continued, moving slowly through the front room, his footsteps deliberate. "Recognized him earlier tonight, despite the years. Imagine my surprise, seeing Thomas Harlan's old deputy back in action." Rebecca's mind raced. If Dixon had spotted Henry, had potentially wounded or killed him. "Tell me, Mrs. Harlan." Dixon's voice came closer, reaching the entrance to the dining room that connected to the kitchen. "Did your husband ever share what really happened that day? How he and Blackwood tore my family apart? How did they let my little brother run wild for years before finally putting him down like a rabid dog?" This was unexpected. "What are you talking about?" Dixon paused, then laughed again, a sound devoid of mirth. "Of course he didn't tell you. Thomas Harlan, the honorable sheriff, wouldn't want his wife knowing he executed an unarmed man." Rebecca's grip tightened on her revolver. This had to be a lie, a tactic to distract her. "Thomas would never—" "Ask Blackwood," Dixon interrupted. "If he's still breathing, that is. Ask him what happened to Craig Dixon 2 years ago." A chill ran through Rebecca. Craig Dixon, whom she had faced just yesterday at her ranch, whom she had seen planning raids in the mine. "Craig is alive," she said. "I saw him myself, at your camp." Dixon stepped into the doorway between the dining room and kitchen, his silhouette clearly visible against the moonlight streaming through the front windows. The rifle in his hands was aimed steadily in her direction. "You saw what I wanted people to see," he said softly. "A ghost, a memory, a reminder of what Thomas Harlan took from me." Rebecca's finger tensed on the trigger, but confusion stayed. In her hand, nothing Dixon said aligned with what she had seen with her own eyes. Craig Dixon had been at her ranch. He had spoken to his men in the mine. He was real. "If Craig is dead, who did I meet?" she demanded. Dixon's smile was visible even in the dim light. cold, triumphant. My son, Craig's boy, spitting image of his father, don't you think? Even took his name in tribute. The revelation struck Rebecca like a physical blow. The younger Dixon hadn't been Craig at all, but a son bearing his name and likeness, a tool in Jackson's elaborate scheme of revenge. Your brother would be ashamed of what you've become, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Dixon's expression hardened. My brother never got the chance to become anything. Your husband saw to that. He raised the rifle. Now it's time to balance accounts. The kitchen exploded in gunfire as both Rebecca and Dixon fired simultaneously. Rebecca felt a searing pain across her upper arm as she dove behind the heavy oak table they had overturned earlier as part of their defenses. Dixon's shot had grazed her, but her own aim had been truer. Dixon grunted in pain, staggering back into the dining room. Blood soaked the sleeve of Rebecca's shirt, but the wound was superficial. Dixon, judging by his labored breathing, had taken a more serious hit. You fight better than most men I've killed, Dixon called, his voice strained. Thomas taught you well. Rebecca didn't respond, using the moment to move to a different position behind the kitchen counter. Dixon wouldn't give up easily, wounded or not. She needed to end this quickly, before blood loss weakened her too severely. Did you know, Dixon continued, obviously trying to locate her by the sound of her voice, that Thomas begged for Craig's life? At the end, when he realized what he'd done, Thomas never begged for anything in his life, Rebecca responded, deliberately projecting her voice from a different location than where she actually was. The tactic worked. Dixon fired at the source of her voice, the bullet harmlessly embedding itself in the adobe wall. Rebecca rolled out from behind the counter, getting a clear shot at Dixon, now illuminated by moonlight, streaming through the dining room window. 2 shots rang out nearly simultaneously, Rebecca's from her position on the floor, and another from the doorway behind Dixon. The outlaw jerked violently, then collapsed. Rebecca scrambled to her feet, Colt still trained on Dixon's motionless form. A figure limped into the dining room from the front entrance. Henry, his left, arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood darkening his shirt, but very much alive. Took your time, Rebecca said, relief evident despite her attempt at nonchalance. Henry grimaced. Got winged. Had to take care of the last of his boys before coming in. He nudged Dixon's body with his boot. Dead? Rebecca knelt beside the fallen outlaw, checking for a pulse. Yes, she confirmed. Your shot or mine? Does it matter? She considered this, then shook her head. I suppose not. Henry surveyed the destruction, broken furniture, bullet holes in the walls, blood staining the floorboards. Ryan was right about one thing. Dixon did make this personal. Rebecca holstered her revolver, suddenly feeling the fatigue of the past 2 days catching up with her. He said something before he died about Craig, said Thomas killed him 2 years ago. Henry's expression darkened. Damn, never wanted you to know about that. So it's true. Rebecca stared at her husband's oldest friend, seeing him in a new light. What happened? Henry sank heavily into a chair that had somehow remained upright through the chaos. Craig Dixon returned to the territory 3 years ago, started rebuilding the gang his brother had run before prison. Violent, unpredictable, worse than Jackson ever was. And Thomas confronted him. Rebecca guessed. The pieces falling into place. Henry nodded soberly. Craig had murdered a family near Silver Creek. Thomas tracked him for 2 weeks. When he caught up to him, he hesitated. Craig went for his gun. Thomas was faster. Self-defense, Rebecca said firmly. That's what the territorial judge ruled. Henry's expression suggested the reality might have been more complicated. Jackson never accepted it, swore revenge. We knew he'd come eventually, but then Thomas got sick. Rebecca looked down at Dixon's body, understanding flooding through her. The raid on her ranch hadn't just been about horses or territory or even simple revenge. It had been the culmination of a blood feud that had spanned decades, a vendetta that had claimed both Dixon brothers and now, finally, Jackson himself. "The young man at the camp," she said, remembering Dixon's revelation. "The one we thought was Craig. He said it was Craig's son." Henry's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Didn't know Craig had a boy." He shook his head slowly. "Another generation dragged into this mess." Outside, the night had grown quiet. The gunfire had ceased, the explosions faded to memory. All that remained was the aftermath. Bodies to be dealt with, destruction to be assessed, wounds to be tended. But Rebecca was alive. Her ranch still stood. The Dixons' reign of terror was over. As she moved to help Henry with his injured arm, a strange sense of completion settled over her. Thomas had started this fight decades ago, standing for law in a lawless land. Today, she had finished it, protecting the home and life they had built together. She hoped wherever he was, he would be proud. Dawn broke over the Harlan Ranch, painting the sky in delicate hues of pink and gold that belied the violence of the night before. Rebecca stood on the porch, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands as she surveyed the aftermath. Bodies had been collected and laid out behind the barn, covered with canvas tarps. The property bore the scars of battle: splintered wood, bullet holes, scorched earth from the explosions, but the house still stood. Henry emerged from the barn, his wounded arm now properly bandaged and supported by a makeshift sling fashioned from one of Thomas's old shirts. Despite the pallor of his face, he moved with purpose, joining Rebecca on the porch. 8 dead, including Jackson, he reported without preamble. No survivors except young Ryan in the root cellar. Rebecca nodded, taking a sip of her bitter coffee. "What about our prisoner?" "Still secured, scared half to death from the commotion. Last night, but unharmed." Henry leaned against the porch rail, grimacing slightly as the movement jarred his injured arm. "What do you want to do with him?" It was a fair question. Ryan had ridden with the Dixon gang, participated in their crimes, including the theft of her horses. By the law's reckoning, he deserved the same fate as his companions. But something in Rebecca hesitated at the thought of executing the young man in cold blood. "We'll take him to Copper Springs," she decided. "Let Sheriff Parker decide what to do with him." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Parker's in Dixon's pocket, or was. He'll probably release the boy the moment we're out of sight." "Maybe," Rebecca acknowledged, "but killing him solves nothing. And someone needs to tell Parker that the Dixon reign of terror is over." She met Henry's gaze steadily. "It has to end somewhere, Henry. The killing, the vengeance, it has to stop, or we're no better than they were." After a moment, Henry nodded. Thomas would say the same thing. They lapsed into silence, watching the sunrise paint the landscape in increasingly vivid colors. The desert had a way of erasing evidence of human conflict, given time. Wind would smooth the disturbed earth, rain would wash away the bloodstains, sun would bleach the splintered wood, nature reclaiming what belonged to it. "We should head out before it gets too hot," Henry said eventually. "It's a long ride to town, with a prisoner in tow." Rebecca drained the last of her coffee. "There's something I need to do first." She walked to the root cellar, lifting the heavy trap door to reveal Ryan, huddled in the corner, his bound hands pulled protectively against his chest. The young man squinted up at the sudden light, fear evident in his face. "Come on," Rebecca said, lowering a rope ladder. "Time to go." Ryan hesitated. "Where?" "Copper Springs. Sheriff Parker can decide what happens to you." Hope flickered across the young man's features, quickly replaced by suspicion. "Why aren't you just killing me like the others?" Rebecca studied him thoughtfully. "How old are you, Ryan?" He straightened slightly. 19. "And how long have you ridden with the Dixons?" 2 years, he admitted, "since my pa died in the mining accident at Silver Peak." Rebecca noted the timing. right around when the younger Craig Dixon had appeared in the territory, building on his father's and uncle's reputation. A vulnerable young man with no family, easy to recruit, easy to mold. "You have a choice now," she said simply. "The Dixons are gone. What happens next is up to you." Ryan absorbed this, his expression shifting from fear to something more complex. Relief, mingled with uncertainty. For a young man who had spent his formative years under the influence of men like the Dixons, the sudden absence of that authority likely felt as terrifying as it did liberating. "What if," he began hesitantly, "what if Parker lets me go?" "Then you go," Rebecca answered. "But you think carefully about where. This territory has a long memory. People won't forget you rode with Jackson Dixon, even if you tried to." Ryan nodded, slowly, understanding the implicit warning. If he returned to his old ways, there would be no third chance. They prepared for the journey to Copper Springs, securing Ryan on the back of the horse he had ridden to the ranch, not bound so tightly as to risk injury during the ride, but securely enough to prevent escape. Rebecca and Henry gathered what they would need for the day's travel, including extra water for the desert crossing. As they were about to depart, Rebecca paused at the corral gate, looking out across the empty space where her horses should have been. 5 animals bred and trained by her own hands over the years, now scattered, perhaps forever lost to her. "We'll ask around in town," Henry said, reading her thoughts. "Dixon's men might have sold some of them before all this." Rebecca nodded, though without much hope. The territory was vast, and horses changed hands frequently. The likelihood of recovering even one of her animals was slim. They set off as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, following the main trail to Copper Springs. Ryan rode between them, silent and watchful, while Henry kept a wary eye on their surroundings. Just because the Dixon leadership had been eliminated didn't mean all danger had passed. Other members of the gang might still be in the territory, unaware of their leader's fate. The journey passed without incident, the miles gradually unfolding beneath their horses' hooves. By mid-afternoon, the familiar silhouette of Copper Springs appeared on the horizon, its dusty main street and weathered buildings a welcome sight after the tensions of the past days. Townsfolk stopped to stare as they rode in. A battered old man with his arm in a sling, a hard-faced woman with blood still visible on her clothing, and a young man, bound and clearly their prisoner. Whispers followed their progress down the street toward the sheriff's office. Sheriff Parker emerged from the jailhouse as they approached, alerted by the commotion their arrival had caused. He was a heavy-set man with a florid face and small, calculating eyes that widened in surprise when he recognized Rebecca. "Mrs. Harlan," he greeted her cautiously. "This is unexpected." Rebecca dismounted, keeping her expression neutral. "Sheriff, we've brought you a prisoner. Ryan here rode with the Dixon gang." Parker's gaze shifted to the young man, then back to Rebecca. "Dixon gang, you say? And where might the rest of them be?" "Dead," Henry replied bluntly, also dismounting despite the obvious pain it caused him, "including Jackson and the one calling himself Craig." A complex series of emotions crossed Parker's face. Shock, disbelief, and something that might have been relief, quickly suppressed. "That's quite a claim, Mr. Blackwood. Do you have proof of this?" "8 bodies at my ranch," Rebecca answered coldly. "You're welcome to retrieve them for proper burial, or leave them for the vultures. Makes no difference to me." Parker paled slightly. "You're saying you and Blackwood killed Jackson Dixon and his entire crew? Just the 2 of you? They came looking for a fight," Henry said. "They found one." A small crowd had gathered, listening intently to this exchange. Parker was clearly aware of his audience, weighing his response carefully. For years, he had accommodated the Dixons out of fear and greed. Now, with their protection suddenly removed, he needed to realign his position, and quickly. "Well," he said, attempting to sound authoritative, "this is a serious matter. I'll need to take your statements and, of course, verify these claims myself." Take all the statements you want, Rebecca replied. The fact remains that the Dixon gang is finished. This territory is free of them for the first time in years. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, hopeful, disbelieving, wondering. The Dixons had cast a long shadow over the region, touching every aspect of life in subtle and not so subtle ways. Their absence would create a vacuum that someone would inevitably try to fill. Parker seemed to realize this as well, his shrewd eyes calculating new angles, new arrangements that might benefit him in the changing landscape. "I'll take the prisoner," he said finally, gesturing for his deputy to approach. "And of course, I'll ride out to your ranch tomorrow to assess the situation." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Henry, both understanding what remained unspoken. Parker would confirm their story, then position himself as instrumental in bringing down the Dixon gang. Politics hadn't changed much since Thomas's day as sheriff. "One more thing," Rebecca added as Ryan was led away. "The Dixons stole 5 horses from my ranch. I want them back." Parker spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "Mrs. Harlan, if Dixon's men sold those horses, they could be anywhere by now. It would be nearly impossible." "Sheriff Parker," Henry interrupted, his voice cutting through the excuses like a knife. "Rebecca Harlan just eliminated the biggest threat to peace this territory has seen in a decade. The least you can do is put out the word about her stolen property." The sheriff flushed, caught between irritation and the pressure of public scrutiny. Of course. I'll make inquiries immediately." With their business concluded, Rebecca and Henry turned toward Granger's general store. Both needed supplies, and Henry's wound required proper medical attention beyond the basic first aid they had administered. Walter Granger greeted them with wide-eyed amazement when they entered his store, news of their confrontation with the Dixons having preceded them. "Lord Almighty," he exclaimed, hurrying around the counter. "When I sent you off with those maps, I never thought you'd actually succeed." "Neither did we," Henry admitted wryly. "Got any whiskey? Medicinal purposes?" Walter produced a bottle from beneath the counter, then insisted on examining Henry's wound himself. "Martha was a nurse during the war," he explained, referring to his late wife. "Taught me a thing or two about patching people up." As Walter tended to Henry's injury, Rebecca restocked essential supplies, ammunition, food, medical items to replace what they had used. The simple domestic task felt strangely disconnected from the violence of the past days, as if she were moving between 2 different worlds. "You know," Walter said conversationally as he rebandaged Henry's arm, "folks will be talking about this for years, the widow who took down Jackson Dixon's entire operation." Rebecca shook her head. "I just defended what was mine." "That's not how legends work, my dear," Walter replied with a smile. "Stories have a way of growing in the telling, and this one's already spreading like wildfire." He wasn't wrong. Even as they completed their business and prepared to depart, Rebecca noticed the way people looked at her, with awe, respect, and a touch of fear. The same way they had once looked at Thomas during his days as sheriff, she realized with a start. Henry noticed it too. "You've made quite an impression," he observed as they mounted up for the return journey. "Half the town's terrified of you, the other half wants to name a street after you." Rebecca adjusted her hat against the late afternoon. "Son, all I want is to rebuild my ranch in peace." "May not be that simple," Henry cautioned. "Power vacuums tend to get filled. With the Dixons gone, others will try to claim their territory, their operations." "That's Parker's problem now," Rebecca said firmly. "I'm a rancher, not a vigilante." Henry looked unconvinced but didn't press the point. They rode in companionable silence as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the trail ahead. About an hour outside of town, they heard it, the distant thunder of hooves approaching from the east. Both tensed, hands moving toward weapons before they consciously registered the action. Old habits formed in the crucible of recent danger. Over the rise appeared a solitary rider, pushing his horse hard. As he drew nearer, Rebecca recognized the young man as one of Walter Granger's shop assistants, dispatched to deliver a message of obvious urgency. "Mrs. Harlan," he called, reining in his lathered horse, "Mr. Granger sent me to catch you before you got too far." "What's happened?" Rebecca asked, immediately alert for new threats. The young man grinned, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "They found one of your horses, ma'am, a big paint stallion. Some prospectors brought him in just after you left town, said they found him wandering near Apache Basin, still wearing your brand." Rebecca's heart leapt. "Domino. That's what Mr. Granger called him. Said you'd want to know right away." Henry smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she had seen from him since this ordeal began. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like at least one thing is finding its way home." They altered course, following the messenger back toward Copper Springs. As they crested the final hill overlooking the town, Rebecca spotted him, Domino, tied to the hitching post outside Granger's store, his distinctive black and white coat unmistakable even at a distance. She urged Mercury to a faster pace, reaching the store ahead of Henry. Dismounting quickly, she approached the paint stallion, who nickered in recognition, tossing his head as if indignant about his recent adventures. "Hello, old friend," she murmured, running a hand along his neck. The horse leaned into her touch, seeming as relieved to see her as she was to see him. Walter emerged from the store, beaming. "The prospectors want a finder's fee, but I told them who they were dealing with. They settled for a bottle of whiskey and some supplies." Rebecca laughed, unexpected tears pricking at her eyes. "Thank you, Walter." "What about the others?" Henry asked, referring to the remaining 4 horses. Walter's expression sobered. "No word yet. But this is a good sign, isn't it? If one made it back, then others might too," Rebecca finished, hope kindling in her chest for the first time. In days, they departed again with Domino in tow, heading back toward the ranch as the sun began to set. The paint stallion fell into an easy step beside Mercury, as if they had never been separated. One small piece of her world was restored. "What will you do now?" Henry asked as they rode. "The ranch needs work." Rebecca considered the question, looking out across the vast landscape that had been her home for 3 decades. "Rebuild. Breed new horses if the others don't return. Keep going." Henry nodded approvingly. Thomas would expect nothing less. "And you?" she asked. "Will you go?" Back to Copper Springs. Henry was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Don't think there's much left for me there. Was only staying to keep an eye on Dixon anyway." He glanced at her. "Thought I might help with rebuilding, if you'll have me." The offer hung between them, weighted with unspoken history. Henry had been Thomas's closest friend, his deputy, his brother in all but blood. They had faced the Dixons together once before, and now, through a twist of fate, had done so again. "I could use the help," Rebecca acknowledged. "My barn roof needs patching, and I'm not as steady on a ladder as I used to be." Henry's face broke into a smile that erased years from his weathered features. "Never were. Thomas used to joke that you were the only person he knew who could fall off a one-step stool." Rebecca laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. When had she last laughed like that? Before Thomas's illness, certainly, maybe even before. As they rode, the setting sun gilded the landscape in shades of amber and gold. Ahead, she could just make out the silhouette of her ranch against the darkening sky, damaged but standing, much like herself. The past days had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had faced the worst kind of men and emerged victorious, not through superior strength, but through courage, resourcefulness, and a refusal to yield what was rightfully hers. Thomas had once told her that the true measure of a person wasn't found in how they handled success, but in how they confronted adversity. By that standard, She had discovered something about herself that perhaps had been there all along, waiting for circumstances to reveal it. The Dixon gang had indeed stolen a widow's horses, but in doing so, they had awakened something far more dangerous than they could have anticipated. A woman who would hunt them through their own territory, who would face their violence with calculated precision, who would end their reign of terror once and for all. As the ranch drew nearer, Rebecca felt a sense of completion settle over her. One chapter closing, another beginning. The road ahead would not be easy. Rebuilding never was. But she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through the darkness of the past days, and she would not face it alone. Domino nickered softly beside her, eager to return to familiar pastures. Henry rode on her other side, a steadfast presence forged in shared danger and mutual respect. Behind them, the sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues, nature's reminder that even the darkest day eventually yields to light. Rebecca Harlan straightened in her saddle and guided her horse toward home. The soft glow of lantern light welcomed them as they approached the ranch house, shadows dancing across the bullet-scarred adobe walls. Rebecca dismounted slowly, every muscle in her body protesting after days of exertion and tension. She led Domino to the damaged corral, running her fingers across the splintered wood. "We'll fix this tomorrow," she promised the horse, securing him with extra care. He would not be stolen again. Henry busied himself unloading their supplies, his movements measured to accommodate his injured arm. "Parker will be out here by noon tomorrow," he predicted. "With an audience, I expect. He'll want witnesses when he claims credit for bringing down the Dixon gang." Rebecca nodded, too weary to feel anger at the sheriff's inevitable politicking. "Let him. As long as he deals with the bodies, he can tell whatever story serves him best." They worked in companionable silence, settling the horses and bringing supplies inside. The house felt different now, not just because of the physical damage from the gunfight, but something more profound. The walls that had witnessed such violence could never be quite the same, just as she herself had been irrevocably changed. "I'll sleep in the barn," Henry offered, as they finished their simple supper of jerky and biscuits salvaged from the kitchen's remains. Rebecca shook her head. "There's the spare room. Thomas would want you to use it." A flicker of emotion crossed Henry's weathered face, gratitude mingled with something deeper. "Been a long time since I slept in a proper bed," he admitted. "Not since Mary passed." "Mary?" Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "You never mentioned being married." Henry stared into his coffee cup, memories playing across his features. "Wasn't for long. Influenza took her back in '92, just a year after we wed." He glanced up with a self-deprecating smile. "Threw myself into work after that. Being Thomas's deputy filled the hours." The revelation offered a new perspective on Henry's dedication to her husband, his willingness to risk his life against the Dixons. He had lost his chance at family, finding purpose instead in loyalty to his friend and, by extension, to her. "Thomas never told me," she said softly. "Asked him not to," Henry replied. "Didn't want your pity back then." "And now?" His eyes met hers, clear and direct. "Now I've got too much respect for you to expect anything of the sort." The simple statement, delivered without flourish, touched something in Rebecca. She had earned this man's respect through action, through standing her ground when others might have fled. It was perhaps the most meaningful tribute she could receive. Dawn found them already at work, beginning the long process of repairing what had been damaged. Henry's skills as a carpenter proved invaluable as they patched bullet holes in walls and mended broken door frames. Rebecca focused on restoring order to the interior, washing away bloodstains and sweeping up shattered glass. By mid-morning, the ranch had assumed a semblance of normalcy, though evidence of the battle remained visible to the discerning eye. As Henry had predicted, Sheriff Parker arrived shortly after noon, accompanied by his deputy and 3 townsmen whose curious expressions revealed their true purpose: to witness firsthand the aftermath of the legendary confrontation. Parker dismounted with exaggerated authority, surveying the property with poorly concealed amazement. The bodies of Dixon's men lay where Henry had arranged them, covered with tarps against the harsh sun. "Mrs. Harlan," the sheriff greeted her, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable days earlier. "I've come to collect the deceased and take your official statement about the events that transpired here." Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron, regarding Parker with a cool assessment. "The bodies are behind the barn, as I told you. As for my statement, it's simple enough. The Dixon gang came to destroy my ranch. They failed." Parker cleared his throat, clearly hoping for more dramatic details he could incorporate into the story he would inevitably spread. "And Jackson Dixon himself? He was among the attackers?" "He led them," Henry confirmed, emerging from the barn. "Made it personal on account of his history with Thomas." This caught Parker's interest. What history would that be? Rebecca and Henry exchanged glances, silently debating how much to reveal. The truth about Thomas's role in Craig Dixon's death was complicated, potentially damaging to his memory in the eyes of those who hadn't known him as they had. "Thomas arrested the Dixon brothers years ago when he was sheriff," Rebecca said finally. "Jackson never forgave him for that. It was a simplification, but not a lie. The deeper truths about Craig's death, about the younger man who had taken his name, about the blood feud that had claimed so many lives, those would remain between her and Henry, at least for now." Parker seemed satisfied with this explanation, jotting notes in a small, leather-bound book. His deputy and the townsmen moved to examine the bodies, their initial excitement giving way to solemn respect as the reality of violent death confronted them. "I've put out word about your other horses," Parker informed Rebecca, seemingly eager to demonstrate his helpfulness now that the power dynamic had shifted. "If they turn up anywhere in the territory, I'll hear about it." "Appreciate that, Sheriff," she replied, her tone neutral. The man's sudden solicitude might be self-serving, but if it helped recover her stolen animals, she would accept it without comment. As Parker and his men loaded the bodies onto a wagon they had brought for the purpose, Rebecca retreated to the porch, watching the proceedings with detached interest. The Dixon gang was being removed from her property piece by piece, their physical presence erased, even as their impact remained. "You did right by those horses," a voice said beside her. Rebecca turned to find one of the townsmen, a wiry, grey-haired individual she vaguely recognized from previous visits to Copper Springs. "Train 'em yourself, didn't you?" She nodded, surprised by his interest. "Raised them from foals, most of them." "Thought so. Got a good eye for horseflesh myself." He extended a calloused hand. "Jim Rawlins, run the livery in Socorro over the mountain. If your other animals turn up for sale anywhere in my vicinity, I'll spot 'em." Rebecca shook his hand. Gratitude, warming her voice. "I'd be obliged, Mr. Rawlins." "It's the least folks can do," he replied earnestly. "What you did here, standing against the Dixons when everyone else just looked the other way, it matters. Changes things for all of us." His words followed her through the remainder of the day, echoing in her mind as she continued the work of restoration. She had not set out to be a symbol or catalyst for change in the territory. Her motives had been purely personal, protecting what was hers, defending the home she and Thomas had built. Yet actions often carried unintended consequences, rippling outward in ways impossible to predict. By defending her ranch, she had inadvertently struck a blow for everyone who had suffered under the Dixons' reign. "Don't look so troubled," Henry observed that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky. "You're thinking too hard again," Rebecca smiled faintly. Rawlins said what we did here changed things for everyone. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that responsibility. Henry considered this, taking a thoughtful sip of coffee. Responsibility already existed. Most folks just ignored it, hoping someone else would act first. He gestured toward the horizon with his cup. This territory's always been balanced on a knife's edge between law and chaos. Every action tips it one way or the other. And we tipped it toward law? Rebecca asked skeptically. Toward justice, at least, Henry amended. Sometimes that's the best we can hope for out here. The distinction was meaningful. Justice wasn't always found in courtrooms or jailhouses, especially in territories where official law often arrived. Too late, if at all. Sometimes it emerged from individual choices, from people willing to stand against wrong regardless of the cost. Thomas had understood this, she realized. It had guided his actions as sheriff, and afterward, when he confronted Craig Dixon, despite no longer wearing a badge. He had acted not from legal obligation, but from moral conviction. The following days established a routine of recovery and renewal. Each sunrise brought new tasks, mending fences, replastering walls, hunting games to replenish their food stores. Henry proved as skilled with tools as he was with tracking, his knowledge of construction techniques surpassing even Thomas's. A week after the confrontation, as they were replacing damaged roof tiles on the barn, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Both tensed instinctively, hands moving toward weapons before their conscious minds had fully processed the potential threat. "Riders," Henry confirmed, shading his eyes against the glare. "3, maybe 4. Rebecca descended the ladder carefully, reaching for the Winchester that had become her constant companion. "Dixon men." "Possible," Henry acknowledged, though his tone suggested doubt. "But they're coming openly in daylight. Not a typical bandit approach." They waited, weapons ready but not yet raised, as the riders drew closer. Gradually, details became distinguishable. 3 men, leading several riderless horses behind them. "My God," Rebecca breathed, recognition dawning. "Those are my horses." Indeed, the distinctive forms of Mercury's stablemates came into focus. The chestnut mare with the white blaze, the dappled grey gelding, the sturdy bay draft horse, all 4 of her remaining animals being led directly back to her ranch. "They see you," riders approached cautiously, clearly noting the armed reception. The leader, a middle-aged man with a silver-streaked beard and the weathered look of a seasoned rancher, raised a hand in peaceful greeting. "Mrs. Harlan," he called when they were within conversational distance. "Burke Taylor from the Circle T up near Mesquite Valley. Believe these animals belong to you." Rebecca lowered her rifle slightly, still wary of deception. "Where did you find them?" "Running wild near my north pasture," Taylor explained. "Recognized the brand. Thomas showed it to me years back when we served together in the Cattlemen's Association." He dismounted, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Word's spreading about what happened here, figuring returning these beauties was the least we could do." Henry stepped forward, offering his hand to Taylor. "That's mighty neighborly. Must have been quite a ride from Mesquite." "Worth every mile," Taylor said firmly, shaking Henry's hand before turning back to Rebecca. "The Dixons rustled 20 heads from me last spring. The sheriff wouldn't even take my report, said I should be more careful about my fencing." His expression hardened briefly. "What you did here, ma'am, standing up to them when no one else would, that took rare courage." Rebecca approached her horses, confirming with her own eyes that they were indeed hers, and appeared unharmed. The chestnut mare nickered in recognition, pushing her soft nose against Rebecca's shoulder in familiar greeting. "They need water and rest," she said, emotion making her voice rougher than intended. "And so do you and your men, Mr. Taylor. We don't have much, but what we have is yours in thanks." Taylor accepted the invitation with grace, and soon the expanded group gathered around a hastily prepared meal in the ranch yard. Taylor's companions, his son and a ranch hand, shared stories of their own encounters with the Dixon gang, tales of intimidation and theft that had gone unaddressed by corrupt or fearful authorities. "Things will be different now," Taylor predicted, as the conversation continued into the evening. "Without the Dixons keeping everyone scared and isolated, ranchers can start working together again, trading fairly, support each other when trouble comes." His vision of renewed cooperation was compelling, especially to Rebecca, who had maintained an increasingly isolated existence since Thomas's death. The possibility of belonging to a community again, not as a widow to be pitied, but as an equal, to be respected, held undeniable appeal. "The territory's changing," Henry observed later, after their guests had departed with promises of future visits. "People like Taylor, they've been waiting for a chance to reclaim what the Dixons took from them. Not just property, but dignity, self-determination." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully, watching the moon rise over the newly repaired corral where all 6 of her horses now grazed contentedly. The return of her animals felt symbolic, pieces of her world coming back together, stronger for having been tested. "What will you do now?" Henry asked, echoing his question from days earlier but with new depth. With the ranch restored, the horses back, the immediate danger past. Rebecca considered the question carefully. A week ago, her answer had been simple: rebuild, continue, survive. But Taylor's visit had planted seeds of new possibilities, expanded horizons beyond mere survival. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time to breed horses again. Not just for our own use, but to sell. Thomas always said this land produced the best stock in the territory." She turned to Henry, decision crystallizing as she spoke. "And I think it's time to open the north pasture, the way we always planned. Use the stream there for irrigation. Expand the herd." Henry's eyes lit with approval. "Ambitious. You'll need help." "I was hoping you might stay on," she acknowledged. "Not just for rebuilding, but for the long term, as a partner." The word hung between them, weighted with potential meanings. Henry studied her face, searching for clarification. "In the ranch," Rebecca specified, though a slight flush colored her cheeks. "Equal shares, equal work. Thomas would have wanted it that way." A slow smile spread across Henry's weathered features. "A partnership, then. Harlan and Blackwood." "Blackwood and Harlan," she countered with a hint of mischief. "Alphabetical order." His laughter broke the moment's tension, warm and genuine in the cool evening air. "Always did have to have the last word, even when Thomas was alive." "He never seemed to mind," Rebecca replied, smiling at the memory. "No," Henry agreed softly. "He never did." The conversation drifted to practical matters: plans for the north pasture, breeding schedules for the mares, improvements to the barn that would accommodate an expanded operation. Yet, beneath the logistics ran a current of shared understanding. They had been forged into something new by fire and blood, their connection now extending beyond their mutual affection for a man long gone. Later, as Rebecca prepared for sleep in the room she had once shared with Thomas, she found herself lingering before his photograph on the bedside table. The image captured him in early middle age, his face unlined, eyes bright with vitality and purpose. "I kept my promise," she told the silent image. "The ranch is safe. Our home stands." No response came, of course, yet she felt a sense of completion, of a circle closing. Thomas had protected her for 30 years, teaching her to survive in this harsh but beautiful land. When the time came, she had protected his legacy in turn, drawing on everything he had given her while adding something uniquely her own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the complexities of an expanding ranch, the evolving dynamics of the post-Dixon territory, the uncertain path of her partnership with Henry. But tonight, Rebecca Harlan slept peacefully, surrounded by the walls she had defended, the horses she had recovered, and the promise of a future she had earned through courage and determination. The widow had indeed hunted her enemies through their own territory, and she had emerged victorious. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.